For 2023, some of the research focus that I have is really trying to dive deep into those undocumented APIs that I mentioned. There has been a lot of success lately and even historically with abusing those. Most recently, there was the Lightspin ECR vulnerability that came to light where it turns out you could just replace any container that was in the public gallery, which is terrifying. So focusing in on those undocumented APIs to perform unintended functionality or to evade detection is a major focus for me.
Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to Cloud Security Podcast Season 4. We've been running for 3 years now. This is our 4th year of running. Thank you so much for all the support. We recently won the Podcast of the Year from SANS Institute. That was pretty amazing. And this would not have been possible without your support that we continue to rank top 100 everywhere. All right. I just want to say thank you, and I should not take too much of your time and get you straight value. So last month, we had AWS reInvent where we covered what was discovered, what was announced at AWS reInvent, what was relevant from a cloud security perspective and moving forward in 2023. This month, we're talking about breaking the AWS cloud. Yes, we've been talking about building so much. I just wanted to make sure we understand how we can break the cloud and specifically break the AWS. By breaking the AWS, I mean finding misconfiguration and vulnerability. So we've got researchers who've been discovering vulnerabilities in AWS space coming throughout the month. To kick things off, we had Nick Frichette. He is a senior security researcher at Datadog who discovered the vulnerability for Confused Deputy with AWS AppSync. We spoke about what was his thought process, how maybe you can use the thought process to discover your own misconfigurations in AWS as well, how easy or hard it is to become a cloud security researcher, because we definitely need a lot more than the 10, 20 people that work in this space at the moment. So if you are someone who's interested in doing cloud security research, this is the episode for you. We spoke about a lot more things around the vulnerabilities that could be discovered. What were some of the common attack scenarios that used to be a thing in the past or maybe are still a thing? And you may be able to discover some yourself as well. Now, if you're watching or listening to Cloud Security Podcast for the second or third time, I would really appreciate if you could give us a follow on our socials. We are on all popular audio and video platform. And if you're listening to this on the audio platform, I would really appreciate if you could drop us a review or rating. If you have any questions, you can drop them here as well, or feel free to reach out to us with your cloud security question, and we would be more than happy to help you out. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Nick about hacking the AWS cloud and how you could become one as well. And I will see you in the next episode as we're continuing the Breaking the AWS Cloud month throughout the remaining of January. Talk to you in the next episode. Peace.
When you're developing an app, security might be treated as an afterthought. With functionality requirements and tight deadlines, it's easy to accidentally write vulnerable code or use a vulnerable dependency. But Sneak can help you secure your code in real time, so you don't need to slow down to build securely. Develop fast, stay secure. Good developer. Sneak.
Nick, welcome, man. Welcome. Thanks for coming in.
Hey, thank you so much for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Oh my God. I think I'm super excited about this, man. I think I wanted to kick off the year by talking about breaking the cloud, and I could not think of someone who can kick off these things but you. It's super awesome that you're here. All right. So the first one, I think I guess the one or two people on the internet who don't know who you are, man. Could you just give us a brief intro about yourself and what do you do for a living?
Yeah, for sure. So, hi everyone. My name is Nick Frichette. I currently work as a senior security researcher at Datadog, where I try to improve our cloud security products. I do a lot of offensive security research in AWS, trying to figure out how an adversary can more effectively attack a cloud environment. What are the misconfigurations they might abuse, or what are the techniques they might use? And then from all that, try and develop ways to detect that behavior and how can we sort of notify customers of misconfigurations or risks. As a result of doing a lot of that research, sometimes I stumble into vulnerabilities in the cloud services themselves. And in those situations, work with cloud service providers to ensure the vulnerabilities are remediated. My background is mostly in penetration testing and software development, which tends to be pretty helpful when it comes to security research.
Wait, and because you mentioned pen testing as well, I think a lot of people kind of assume this cloud security research is pen testing. And maybe a good place to start also is when people ask you, what do you really do when you're doing research? Because, there's like this, so many subsets of research as well. There's the whole bug bounty. Hey, I'm a researcher for fun. Hey, I'm a pen tester. So could you just throw some light on each one of these and how would that relate to from a cloud context?
Sure. Yeah. So in general, pen testing is a point in time security assessment of an environment or an application. Typically, you're only interested in, if we were to use cloud terminology, the customer side of the shared responsibility model. So the customer is responsible for the infrastructure that they deploy, the software that they use, and things like that. Whereas the cloud service provider is responsible for the security of the cloud, of the underlying resources and services. As a pen tester, you're really only focused on that customer side, and you're trying to ensure that your clients are secure to the best of their ability. As a researcher, like you mentioned, there's a ton of different areas of research that you can be involved in. I have colleagues who work in threat research, tracking real world adversaries and stuff like that. I have other colleagues who work in supply chain security research, so trying to figure out how adversaries can abuse supply chain and do attacks against those. For me personally, I get to do a lot of the offensive security stuff, so it's more hypothetical. I'm not actually targeting individual environments, but from that research, trying to then apply those to real environments to make sure that customers are secure, as well as trying to prevent, hopefully, somebody from abusing those cloud resources.
I think you kind of mentioned it, like the hypothesis that you come up with and assumptions that you would use. Because what's the thinking there? Because you almost have to, like, how a lot of us, probably people who are listening in as well, all tuned in, when we read about an AWS service that is released, we're just looking at, oh, it's an S3 bucket. I can use it as a Dropbox. I can drop my files in there. It'll be amazing. Like, we always think of the positive workflow. We never think about how would I break this? And maybe, I don't know if that's the right word to use for it, but how do you normally approach research and the hypothesis that you kind of, use as a foundation to, I'm going to keep researching on this and see where I come up with?
Yeah, sure. So, in general, my process for security research is largely in two phases. In phase one, I just try to understand as much as I can about a particular service as possible. So, reading documentation, building like small test projects with it, just to try to see how it works, figure out what the default configuration is if you were to create it with the console and things like that. Once I have a really good understanding of like how it works and what the fundamental underpinnings are, that's when in phase two, I start asking questions about like, hey, how does this service authenticate to something else? Or, did the developers consider what would happen if use a particular type of input? And if they did, how do we get around any sort of validation or checks they might have implemented? So it's a lot of trying to understand things very fundamentally and then trying to abuse those services in ways that probably weren't intended.
Ah, right. I guess you're not really actively, to your point, say building a service and breaking it, I guess. Because a lot of us would be, hey, I use S3 bucket for, I don't know, it's uploading files, I guess. So, and that's what my theme needs. And a lot of times, I think to your point, there are new services that come in. Would this approach be applicable for, AWS reInvent just went by in the last month? Now, many new services came in. Have you been able to use some of these kind of thinking for newer services as well? Or usually would you pick like a popular services because, there's like a lot of use cases for people are using it for, because there's this whole thinking that, well, actually it's an MVP service. So it's not really full-fledged usable service as well from AWS. Is there like something like that in your thinking as well when you're looking for research on what kind of hypothesis and what services you would go for?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It sort of depends on what exactly we're trying to do. So for work, we try to prioritize different research projects based on customer need. So for example, if we don't have any customers using, say for example, something kind of esoteric like AWS Personalize, we're probably not going to schedule a project for it. But if it's something more popular, something that they use a lot of, we will be incentivized to do a research project on it. That's why, for example, on AWS AppSync, that was one of our research projects just because it was pretty popular within the community. It was something we wanted to try and understand better to build products around.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue into my next question about the AppSync vulnerability, which was the confused deputy vulnerability that you had identified.
Yep,
And kind
that's
of
correct.
like, could you explain the thinking behind it? And maybe even like for people who don't know what AppSync is, maybe just like a, I don't know, 5-second, 10-second version of what it is and what do people use it for?
Yeah, for sure. So AWS AppSync is a GraphQL service from AWS. It makes it very easy for you to create GraphQL web, and it has all sorts of fun and useful features to be able to create your schema. It'll build all the resources for you. It'll create the roles and whatnot. So it's a great service in that sense. As for the confused deputy vulnerability, what that is, a confused deputy vulnerability is a vulnerability in which a lower privileged entity, typically the attacker, is able to convince a much more higher privilege entity to perform some action on their behalf. So essentially, we're just trying to trick a service to do something for us. Now, in most cases, and in on-prem security, this situation doesn't typically arise. I remember the first time that I heard it back when I was doing more on-prem pen testing, I was kind of like thoroughly unimpressed, like, why is this an issue? But in the cloud, the confused deputy vulnerability is actually super, super applicable because there is a lot of services that will exhibit this behavior of, I need to ask, say, for example, the AppSync service to do something for me. As for the vulnerability itself, in very much the same way that I described with two separate phases, in phase one, we came to understand how AppSync worked. And to oversimplify just a little bit, the way it works is that when you interact with a GraphQL AppSync API, AppSync, the service, will then assume a role in an account and then perform some action. So if you create an API to interact with, say, DynamoDB, for example, it would assume a role and then talk to DynamoDB. And in phase two, that behavior seemed pretty interesting because how does AppSync know which role to assume? And we quickly came to realize, oh, it's just an API call. You pass in a role and it will execute for you. And so the second question was, okay, what happens if I point to a role in a different account? And so we did that, and unsurprisingly, it failed. There was an error, and AWS did, the same threat modeling that we did. I came to the same conclusion that if you were able to specify arbitrary roles, that would be pretty dangerous. And so now, and to be fair, that was pretty expected, nothing too surprising there. So the question now became, how do we get past that validation? And what we very quickly found was that the API, what was interesting about it was that it was case insensitive. You could pass in JSON objects where the keys could be of any casing, uppercase, lowercase, somewhere in between, and it would still function, which is a bit odd. And ultimately from that, we found that if you passed in that role with a unique casing or in a slightly different casing than what they were expecting, that validation step wouldn't occur. And so what we were able to do is just change that, pass in any role we wanted, and now suddenly AppSync would do our bidding and assume any role that had a trust relationship with that service. So if you used AppSync for any of your APIs or your services, we could just point to that role and have AppSync assume the role and do whatever we wanted to. And we did report this to AWS, and they have since remediated the issue.
Right. So, and maybe just to understand the gravity of this a bit more as well, because people who are listening in, probably some of them are builders, some of them are breakers. When I say builders and breakers, I mean builders who are building solutions on AWS, breakers who are pen testers or researchers as well. It's almost like when you say that, yeah, okay, you can use cross account, some people may not even know the gravity of what that cross account means. Could you kind of let me peel another layer for why cross-account is such a big thing in AWS?
Yeah, so cross-account issues is one of the more severe types of vulnerabilities that's possible. Essentially, what that means is that, theoretically, I would have been able to take over, interact with, destroy, steal any other AWS AppSync customers' resources. I could just convince the AppSync service to do my bidding, in a sense, and go after another customer without any other authorization or authentication needed. I just needed to know the role to have it assume, which is terrifying. And that's why these types of vulnerabilities get such sort of huge notice within the community because of their potential impact.
For another context as well, for people who are building like maybe solution architects or trying to go down that path as well for this. The other half is also that when you're told to build a solution, people always pick your standard, account is the highest level of segregation you can have. So you should use that as a way to separate accounts or separate resources and separate environments as well. So I think that's pretty cool what you found, man. So I've got a question here, and I just realized that was Jonathan. Hey, Nick, do you have a minimum level of blue teaming detective controls in place when conducting your red teaming?
Gotcha. So I don't do any red teaming. Back in the day, I was a penetration tester, and I did assist with some red teaming type stuff, but these days I just do pure security research. Do I use blue team controls while doing research? Absolutely. In fact, I actually hook up the account just like you would to a SIEM, same way that you would do with your own resources. And I use that to monitor what's going on and see if I'm being noticed or if I'm being seen. Sometimes I'm not, and that's where we sort of need to explore what more controls do we need or what sort of resources do we need.
Awesome. Thank you. If I were to add another layer to it, because a lot of builders may even be curious about, every time I look at a service now, is there a set of minimum or like a high level detective controls I should be thinking about? Like, how, and I don't know how many people would be aware of this, but people who do architecture, they kind of think about, okay, what are we doing for key management? What are we doing for identity management? What are we doing for backup and recovery? What would it look like disaster recovery? All that. They're like big components. From a detection perspective, is there like a similar framework or approach that you recommend to people to say, when you're building, I guess you can obviously use tools to, identify rules and that should protect you or whatever. But is there like a general rule that you kind of say protect your data, or I don't know, like I'm just making up like scenarios here, but in terms of, is there like a framework that you think of that people can use to apply detective controls on the services that they may be working in, especially if there's a new service?
Yeah, so I think in general, specific to AWS, following things like the well-architected framework will really, in general, set you up for success. You want to be sure that you have proper monitoring in your environment, particularly on things such as CloudTrail, which is sort of the source of truth as to what took place in an account. Beyond that, having, say, some sort of CSPM in place, some sort of posture management to be mindful of the state that your resources are in. And hopefully you don't have a situation where, that developer who created an S3 bucket to store who knows what, hopefully it's not public to the world. And if it was, hopefully you have tools in place to quickly report that to you, or even perhaps automatically take care of that for you. That type of response would be incredibly helpful in a cloud environment.
That's pretty fascinating for me as well. Say, for example, we kind of go down the path and we stumble upon, I don't know, like to what you said, cross tenant or cross account vulnerability or potential vulnerability. I shouldn't say vulnerability. What's the guideline here? Like, I think if any of us normal people who are not doing research on a regular basis stumble upon something which feels suspicious, is there like a guideline of some sort available from like Amazon to kind of work around these things? Or how do you just go about even disclosing something to Amazon?
Yeah, so disclosure is pretty easy. I admit the first time you do it, it's probably scary and you're not really too sure what the best way to do it is. With more recent times, we're at least folks at Datadog, we're comfortable enough with the cloud security providers that we can just send a text to some people we know to let them know that, hey, things are coming, and send an email. In general, every cloud service provider has what they call a vulnerability disclosure program, and it takes a couple different forms. Some of them have like a web form that you can, others have an email address that you can send to. And in those situations, you want to try to provide as much details as possible as to what you found, where you found it, why you think it might be a security issue, and have the cloud service providers themselves evaluate it. They tend to be very responsive, trying to react quickly to customer concerns, and they'd probably be the best people to talk to in terms of making sure that they get resolved.
And to your point then, how long should one wait before, I guess, getting a response and putting a blog out, I guess? Because there's always like this gray area of, I've disclosed it, I haven't heard back for 1 month. What do I do? Like, should I just post it on a blog?
Well, it depends. I suppose it depends on the nature of the vulnerability and what the impact might be. So, for example, in general, the cloud service providers are very good about responding. Even if they disagree, if they don't think it's an issue, they'll be pretty upfront and tell you. And in those situations, you did your due diligence, you spoke with the cloud service provider. May not hurt to put out a blog post and sort of share your findings. At the same time, though, in general, they're pretty responsive. So if you did find something, it'll almost assuredly get fixed. It's just a matter of how long will it take.
All right, fair enough. And I think also worthwhile calling out, right? You kind of mentioned at the beginning of this interview as well, shared responsibility. And from a pen tester's point of view, what's the point where you feel sometimes in like for people who have kind of done some kind of pen testing or research, when you find an web application and you get to a point where you have an open S3 bucket, and for whatever reason, you find that you have credit card information there. I mean, you were just looking for your credit card, but you realize that, oh, wait, I can change the number from 1 to 2 on the URL. And now I can see Ashish's credit card information in his statement as well. Where do you, I think obviously at that point in time, you can disclose to the company, whoever the customer or whoever the actual bank is. But if you're the bank employee yourself, and it sounds like you have done the right thing in terms of application, and it just happens to be something on the Amazon end, where should people draw the line for, okay, at this point in time, I should stop here before it becomes illegal? Is there like a line that is drawn something like that?
Well, it depends. I think the best rule of thumb to follow is it depends on who would be responsible for fixing the situation. If it is the responsibility of the company, the people who deployed the infrastructure, then it's on them. But if it would be the responsibility of the cloud service provider due to some vulnerability on their end, then it would be their responsibility, and that's who you would contact. Particularly if you're, say, an external assessor, maybe you're a consultant with a company you've only known for a couple days, it might be a little bit difficult to discern which is which. But in general, it's much, 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 much more likely that you'll find a vulnerability in a customer deployed thing than you would something on the cloud service provider side, just due to the nature of how many people are attacking these resources and assessing their security.
Wow. So you reckon it'll be much more harder for people to find vulnerabilities, or vulnerability is the wrong word, but maybe even misconfiguration on the cloud end?
I shouldn't say unlikely. It's less likely than the customers, just due to the nature of the how seriously the cloud service providers take security. They're certainly not perfect. We're all human. Mistakes happen. Things slip through. But in general, it's more likely that the customer has a security issue than the service provider.
Awesome. And I think that makes me kind of think about another angle as well. Now, since we kind of know the boundaries, we also know that there are options to raise it with the cloud provider, AWS. What are some of the attack techniques people can actually think about? Like, because you know how when people think of pen testers and they just think of, or maybe even hackers for that matter, like bad hackers, I mean, if someone's wearing a hoodie in a dark basement, has really sharp skills on command line terminal, is there a similar criteria to even get into the cloud security research space? So I think, are we supposed to be, I don't know, super geniuses in command prompt and everything else that kind of goes with it? Or is there a attack technique that you normally use and people can easily pick it up as well and do their own research?
Yeah, I mean, in order to get into the cloud security space, honestly, it's a pretty low bar. For whatever reason, I've always been a little surprised that there seems to be so few people like actively involved in trying to find cloud security issues. Although more recently that has changed. There's definitely more of us kicking around now. In terms of skills or things to know, I think, having a good foundation in sort of common pen testing techniques, web application testing, especially for the cloud, would be very helpful. As silly as it sounds, sometimes you find sort of generic OWASP top 10 type cross-site scripting, SQL injection type stuff. The other advice I would give to somebody who's interested in cloud research or cloud security research would be to try and think more holistically about the attack surface as it relates to the cloud service provider. Like, yes, you'll find those OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities, but there's much more interesting ones that are related to how the cloud services work. If you can invoke an API call without that getting logged to CloudTrail when it normally would, that would be pretty significant for an adversary to abuse, because now they're suddenly invisible to a customer. Or if you can, like we mentioned with AppSync, if you can trick a service to access another customer's resources, that's also pretty scary. So in general, trying to think more about how the cloud services work and using that to your advantage would be a lot of help.
Right. Okay. There is the angle of, yes, we need to understand AWS services in the first place as well. And I normally believe that usually people who are building solutions are probably more exposed to all these, or maybe have a higher probability of finding those misconfigurations at the AWS end. So yeah, I guess keep an eye out, I guess, for people who are listening to this and going, okay, I should definitely try and do something. So if you, for whatever reason, think that this is a vulnerability or a misconfiguration, you should definitely disclose it, especially if it's an OWASP vulnerability as well. Because do you find, what's the more common vulnerability misconfiguration that you hear of from an AWS perspective? Because, when I was starting like 6-7 years ago in this whole cloud space, people didn't believe cloud. People were just like, oh, I can't trust cloud. Now the trust is automatic. But I love this research field, and that's why I've dedicated a whole month on the Cloud Security podcast for this as well, is because that notion is now changing to, I trust cloud, but have we configured it correctly? And I think that's like the new messaging that people are using these days. And I kind of love that. So to your point, then, with this new notion coming in, do you find that there is a common vulnerability that used to be found quite easily earlier, but not anymore? Like, so, it would have been something that obvious you would search for, like an open S3 bucket, but they don't exist anymore as much. Is there a sense of pattern that you found so far that, oh yeah, that's very rare now?
None come to mind. I think it is safe to say that the example you gave with the public S3 bucket, those are starting to become less and less common. Unfortunately, it does still happen. I think as recently as like a week ago, there was another big name bucket exposure.
I don't know how they did it, but somehow they managed to do it, because it's not even possible in the console anymore.
So I tried recently to create a public bucket, and like there's so many like, do you understand what you're doing? Click here,
Yeah.
I have to imagine it's probably like infrastructure as code or something, or they're copy pasting something in there. But yeah, I think that is starting to get a little better. And of course, in April, I believe they'll be enforcing preventing public access by default. So making it even more difficult for people to have public S3 buckets. I think another really common vulnerability / misconfiguration, more realistically, is IMDS v1 versus version 2, so the instance metadata service. As a former pen tester, I can't tell you how many attacks would have been stopped if they had just used IMDS v2. That has additional protections to prevent things like server-side request forgery. It prevents certain types of attacks based on networking, so preventing the number of hops between networking. One of my best advice I can give for anyone doing AWS security is enforce IMDS v2 across all your EC2 instances, and you'll resolve a lot of potential issues.
Wait, you should explain that a bit more as well. So what is IMGS v2? And because people would not even know like v1, v2, like, I don't know what is IMGS. What is it? You can even put the IP address as well in there, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. So the instance metadata service is this handy little service that hangs off of an EC2 instance, and it's at that 169.254, 169.254 IP address. The instance metadata service has a lot of useful metadata, as you can assume, about that EC2 instance. So what's its public IP address? What security groups is it in? It has information as to what account it's in and things like that, what a size of EC2 instances is, whether it's like a T2 micro or something else. Most important for security is if there's a role associated with that EC2 instance, then there are IAM credentials for that role at that metadata service. And so version 1 had sort of an unfortunate design setup or a design implementation where all it took to get those credentials was a simple GET request to a very particular endpoint, and you could just have them. And of course, that leaves it vulnerable to things like server-side request forgery or XML external entity attacks, where an attacker is able to make a request to that service and then steal those IAM credentials and use them for whatever they want to do. Version 2, which came out, I believe, in early 2020, although I might be mistaken about that, has some additional protections in place. So instead of just a simple GET request, there is now a sort of a handshake that occurs where you have to get a token and then you use that token in subsequent requests. While that doesn't fully, like 100% mitigate the risk of server-side request forgery, it's pretty unlikely that an attacker would be able to do that. Setting headers is pretty non-standard, and it does have additional benefits as well. So it prevents certain networking configurations from accessing it. For example, say in like a CI/CD scenario, if an attacker gets their way into a Docker container, the default networking configuration of Docker can't talk to the metadata service. So they can't even reach out and connect with it. So it's definitely better to have version 2 than version 1 with all the additional protections it affords.
Yeah, and I think it's funny, I think you mentioned server-side request forgery as well. It's been a while since I've heard a server-side request forgery, but to what you said, it's kind of like, I always compare it to the unpatched Windows 98 that is still running somewhere at the moment. It's almost very similar where a lot of people raise vulnerabilities around SSRF and being a common thing. And I guess for context, for people who have probably heard of this for the first time, the 169.254, 169.254, that works across everyone. It's not like, oh, Nick has a special one, I have a special one. No, I can access everything that Nick's, I guess, AWS account would have if I have access to. If I have an IAM role that gives me access to, which is an IAM role in Nick's account, I can use 169.254 to basically discover everything inside his account as well. Is that a fair summary of how bad this could be, Nick?
Well, it depends. It's totally possible that those credentials might have no privileges at all. The unfortunate thing, though, is that typically they have something you would want, right? Your app has to do something, or else you wouldn't be making it. So typically, we can just abuse that functionality and access those resources.
Yeah, and I think the specific scenario that I call out is when I was talking to a few people during consulting, a lot of people would also talk about the fact that they would just put an empty IAM role onto EC2 instances. This is back in the day when you could not later on add an IAM role to an EC2 instance. Now, at least, I believe you can edit and add an IAM role later on. What people used to do earlier would just add an empty IAM role to an EC2 instance. And I'm like, oh, that's like brewing ground. If for whatever reason EC2 is compromised, all I have to do is just update my IAM role to have permissions, but I can still explore and discover. But anyway, I think you're right. You're on the money there. I've got a comment from Tom as well, he's mentioned there's some great cloud pen testing platforms like SAT-Cloud from NCC Group and Cloud Goat from Rhino Lab that's set up vulnerable by design so you can practice cloud pen tests without getting in trouble. Do you know of any? Thanks for sharing that as well, Tom. I don't know if you've used any, Nick, or have you heard of them as well?
Yeah, I've actually used both. There are definitely a lot of really good resources out there if you're trying to learn more about cloud security without without actually attacking a cloud environment. I've also heard of Hack the Box has some labs that are super, super helpful. And then full disclosure, I made this, but I've also created a cloud-based CTF called CIC Don't. So trying to teach sort of common cloud CI/CD misconfigurations and security issues and actually abusing them.
Cool. So what was the service called again?
CI/C Don't. So CI/C Don't. It's part of Hacking the Cloud, which is an open source encyclopedia of offensive security techniques that I developed. Just trying to share more information with the community and sort of provide an avenue for different security techniques. And it's available at hackingthe.cloud.
All right, I'll make sure I'll put the link for that as well. Awesome. And thanks for that link as well, Tom. And I think the one thing that I kind of keep coming back to, again, since we've kind of gone through a few parts of the whole experience of doing some research, is also, I guess, Hack the Cloud as well that you kind of have been working on. What's Hack the Cloud about? And I guess, why did you start that? And what was the story behind it?
Yeah, so I created Hacking the Cloud back in the day. Working as a penetration tester, I was pretty surprised early on that there really wasn't a lot of good offensive security training for penetration testers in AWS. There's stuff like the aforementioned server-side request forgery to the EC2 metadata service, but I was kind of expecting there to be more and more information. And so as a result of sort of wanting to find out more, I developed Hacking the Cloud to try and more easily share that information, because before it's scattered between blog posts and conference talks and all kinds of little things. So Hacking the Cloud is sort of a centralized location where these techniques can be shared and give it a little bit more light. A one-stop shop essentially for offensive security techniques that both offensive security professionals and defensive security professionals can use to improve their security posture.
Yeah, and you've been maintaining the blog for a long time now, right?
Yeah, I think it was in 2020 that it launched. So it's been going for a while. I'm sure we'll get to 3 years here soon. Last year we had over 73,000 visitors and some crazy number of page views. So it's slowly been chugging along in the background.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great resource as well for people who are trying to at least go down the path of identifying what could go wrong. Because I think the harder piece, and maybe you can shed some light on this, can only a pen tester think about vulnerabilities or misconfigurations in AWS. So I personally believe that it's just about thinking about how to breaking it, like how would you break it? But I don't know, what's your personal opinion on the whole, everyone who's probably listening to this and going, oh, Nick is just special. Nick is just awesome. He's got a cool t-shirt on, enjoy cybercrime.
Yeah.
And I need a cool t-shirt and probably as much as experience as Nick does to even go down the path of even doing this for fun if I wanted to do it on the side. What's your thought on for people who are probably thinking about approaching this? Would you say it should be straightforward, or is it just basically complicated?
No, honestly, it's pretty simple. I did say that all I had to do to find a cross-tenant vulnerability was change a single letter. So as silly as it sounds, sometimes there are vulnerabilities that have, really significant impact that are relatively simple. I think, pretty much anybody, if you wanted to be a cloud security researcher or even, as a hobby, that's personally what I did, just trying to develop research techniques and findings and attack techniques. I did it as a hobby and somehow it turned into a full-time job. I think in general, as long as, you can reproduce the work and you can demonstrate, that, hey, this is just a weird, super strange scenario, like it actually does function the way that we think it does. Yeah, I think anybody could be a researcher for sure.
Yeah. And I think we definitely need a lot more because Nick, you kind of touched on this earlier. And it's one of the reasons why we have the whole Breaking the Cloud month as well, because there's not researchers in this space as well. There are researchers for web app, there are researchers for all these other things, but for somehow cloud, it doesn't have as many researchers. I think maybe less than 10 or maybe 20, I guess. And to think that how big the space is, only having 10 to 20 people, I think 20 is stretching it, right? 10 is probably the right number. That is very handful of space. So we definitely need a lot more of them as well. Question from Winnie, do you have other cloud providers in your Hack into the Cloud, I guess the blog that you have?
Yeah, so most of the content, something like 95%, is all AWS, and I've written the vast majority of it. We do have some submissions for GCP and Azure. Other folks have submitted that content and added it. So there might be some, definitely though, AWS has been the predominant just because that's what I mostly focus on.
Yeah. So, and if you find something, if for anyone who's listening who find something in AWS, Azure, GCP as well, they can submit the request. Is that right?
Yep, for sure. Yeah, we're totally 100% open to anyone who wants to submit a pull request.
Awesome. Cool. So thanks for that question as well, Vinny. All right. I've got one question from Jimmy. Sorry. Hey, Jimmy. Thanks for the question as well. So Jimmy's asked a question. Do you have any tools you enjoy using, Nick, commercial or open source when conducting research?
Ooh, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. So in general, one of the hard things about the cloud security community being so small and there's not many people is that you kind of have to create your own tools. So over the years, I developed a little bit of a toolbox for using different things. So for example, for signing API requests, I don't typically use something like the AWS CLI or any of the SDKs. I actually manually sign them. And so I built a tool that allows me to do that as quickly as possible and efficiently as possible, because otherwise it takes way too long. Some other tools that I've built, I built a fuzzer for the AWS API. As you can imagine, sometimes you want to send a lot of requests. And so building a fuzzer was definitely one of the better tools that I've made, although I did unfortunately get like a $3,000 AWS bill by fuzzing. So in big bold letters I have on the GitHub page, I'm not responsible for what you do. Don't use this blindly. Thankfully that got resolved. But I'd say, yeah, the signer and then the fuzzer have been some of the best tools that I've personally had to make. Having a good SIM is also very useful for a research perspective, just so that you can quickly look through CloudTrail logs and see what was detected, what wasn't detected, and as well as looking for opportunities within logs for trying to avoid detection.
All right. Actually, that's an interesting thing. Just an extension from what Jimmy's asked as well. If you were to kind of do research and how you mentioned you can use SIEM if you have a good SIEM for CloudTrail. What's your data point in the AWS side to see what's happening? I guess for each service, there seems to be CloudWatch, CloudTrail, pump everything into that direction. Are those probably the sources? What's the thinking there? Is the thinking that or aim to try and have everything in CloudWatch or CloudTrail, or rely on logging from the service itself?
Yeah, so I rely almost entirely on CloudTrail. CloudWatch tends to be a little bit more like service specific, and it's more about like performance type stuff or like number of occurrences as opposed to like API actions. So in general, it's all CloudTrail. Personally, full disclosure, I work at Datadog, but I use Datadog in order to review those CloudTrail logs, see what's coming in, and trying to identify, hopefully, if I haven't been detected within those logs and things like that.
Right. Yeah, because I would imagine one of the hardest things to do in researching is also identifying what's really happening, so you can basically, I guess, peel off the layers and see what you can find or do with it as well. I've got a similar question, I guess, extension of that. Fair asked, can you provide some tips or research at least on how we should get into a cloud service internals? I'm assuming by that he's referring to, I guess, services or commands from cloud, but I'll let you answer based on the interpretation that you've had.
So that's a really good question. And honestly, that's one of the major things that I sit around thinking about all day is like, how do I figure out how this service works or what I can do to it? I think there's a number of great places to start. So the AWS console is actually like a really fantastic place to figure out how something's working internally. You can, as silly as it sounds, if you hit F12 and you go to the network tab, just watch all of the requests that your browsers are making to the AWS services, because in your browser, the client is forming API requests to backend services. And that's a great place to find out about things like undocumented APIs, or for APIs that may have additional functionality. You can all see that occurring. And then from there, you can take those API requests and you can sign your own, and you can start doing things like trying to send malicious inputs, or you can try and reformat requests, and you can look at things like trying to abuse those services. That's probably the best place to start. Some other minor tips, and I can only speak to AWS because that's the cloud I'm most familiar with, but different cloud service providers have different ways of sort of formatting their API requests. In AWS, there are multiple different protocols that you can use to format requests. So getting familiar with those, reading through things like the SDKs, so how those API requests are made, can also be incredibly helpful to figure out how the services work and identify opportunities for you to abuse them.
Awesome. Yeah, that is great advice there as well. Do you find that documentation in general, or especially API documentation, you mentioned SDK documentation, API documentation, have you ever had the thing that it has services probably not disclosed, I guess, in terms of it commands you can, I don't know, delete command in like a HTTP verb, which is not there, but you can use it?
Yeah, all the time. There are so many AWS API calls that actually aren't documented anywhere, or at the very least, if you Google their name, nothing shows up. There are a ton of them that are undocumented in a sense, and so it can be difficult trying to figure out like what services are and how they interact. And so that's part of the fun, is though trying to fit the puzzle pieces together and actually do that research. Sometimes you find APIs that they didn't intend to expose, and sometimes you can abuse those APIs.
Awesome. And I've got another question here quickly. Do you have any cloud security lab resources that you recommend?
Good question. So in general, I know folks have spoken very highly about the Hack the Box AWS Cloud Security Lab. I forget the name. I think it's Hailstorm or something. I know they have a number of cloud security labs, and each cloud service provider, they give it another unique storm name. So I think it's Hailstorm. Outside of that, there are things like Cloud, which I believe is from Rhino Security, or SAD Cloud, which I think is NCC. So those can also be really excellent. But additionally, sometimes you can just spin up stuff in your own AWS account, being mindful of the costs, of course, and you can just sort of interact with those resources and sort of evaluate them and sort of get an understanding for the security implications.
Awesome. And that question was from Eugen Austin. Thanks for that question. Hopefully I pronounced your name correctly as well, man. I've kind of covered most of the questions that I had in mind, and unless there are any more questions coming in, it's kind of like the tail end of the interview, where I also ask 3 fun questions because non-technical, so people get to know you a bit more as well. The first one being, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on researching cloud vulnerabilities?
Ooh, okay. What do I do most? I'm a big home labber. If you're familiar with that, a lot of like self-hosting type stuff. Over to my left, I have a 22U rack with some server components. I'm a big fan, as crazy as it sounds, I'm big on self-hosting your own data, not having it shared out there in the cloud, just for the sake of like, hey, I know where my stuff is and there's no risk of somebody else seeing it or stealing it or who knows what. And I spend a lot of time, probably too much time, just sort of maintaining that infrastructure, upgrading it, and assessing new projects that I could deploy at home.
That's pretty awesome. And I was going to say, you probably should blog this somewhere if you haven't blogged already, how to keep your data stored locally. And
Yeah, it's definitely something I've considered. It's just a matter of trying to find time for it.
yeah, of course. Like everything else, man, I think I was trying to find time for things as well. I've got the next question. What is something that you're proud of but is not on your social media?
Ooh, something that I'm proud of. That's interesting. What am I proud of?
Sounds like your server, because your server is not there on the internet.
Yeah, no, that's a fair example. I'm pretty proud of that. I don't know what am I proud of. To be honest, most of what I do is something related to tech. I'll say in school, I definitely was not the best candidate for like a computer science degree. I was not much of a math guy, but I just sort of powered through and managed to do really well. So I'd say, focusing through that was definitely worth it.
Awesome. And last question that I have for you is, what's your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share?
Ooh, cuisine or restaurant? There is a restaurant in my town called Medici's, and they have this fig pizza thing, which is incredibly good. It's got like fig on it, and it has, I think it's prosciutto is the meat. It's pretty fantastic. Definitely one of my favorites.
Wow. Cool. Awesome. That was all the questions we had. I do really thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate this. And for people who are listening in and have more questions, feel free to reach out to Nick directly as well. If they don't reach out to you, where can they find you on the internet?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter. I tweet pretty regularly about, security techniques that I'm exploring or sometimes critiquing real-world intrusions and why some adversaries don't do so well. And then you can also probably find me on Mastodon. I'm at Frichette@fastodon.org.
Is that I didn't realize Mastodon was still a thing. I just saw it. It just basically blends into the background as well. So, if people are on Mastodon, definitely check out Nick there as well. And I'll leave the link to all of his, I guess, socials as well as I kind of put them on the blog. But dude, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate you kind of hanging out with us. Quickly, someone just recommended AWS Goat as well. That's a good service as well. Yep. So definitely check that out. Thank you so much. Oh, there you go. I've got another question. What are some of your focus areas of research in 2023?
Ooh, okay, that's a really good question. For 2023, some of the research focus that I have is really trying to dive deep into those undocumented APIs that I mentioned. There has been a lot of success lately, and even historically, with abusing those. Most recently, there was the Lightspin ECR vulnerability that came to light, where it turns out you could just replace any container that was in the public gallery, which is terrifying. So focusing in on those undocumented APIs to perform unintended functionality or to evade detection is a major focus for me. Additionally, as an aside, I am pretty interested in learning more about Kubernetes. I know enough to be dangerous, but there's always so much more you can learn when it comes to a complex topic like Kubernetes. So exploring that and then its specific impacts on the cloud service providers, distribution of Kubernetes is a major focus for me as well.
Awesome. Thank you for the question, and thank you for the answer as well, Nick. Awesome. All right, that was all the questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and questions as well. Feel free to reach out to Nick or to myself if you have more cloud security questions, but I will see you next week with another episode. And I think it's funny, most of the names that came up over here are also coming in this month as well. So it's going to be really interesting because we've got Gafneet coming in as well later this month as well. So she can talk about because that's where the whole undocumented API thing. I'm like, what is an undocumented API? I'm like, yeah, it's like, and he just like happened to stumble onto it. So I'm sure that story would be quite interesting as well. But dude, thanks so much for this, man. And thank you everyone who's tuned in. We'll see you next week for the next episode of Breaking the AWS Cloud Month in January. And we'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone else.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
For 2023, some of the research focus that I have is really trying to dive deep into those undocumented APIs that I mentioned. There has been a lot of success lately and even historically with abusing those. Most recently, there was the Lightspin ECR vulnerability that came to light where it turns out you could just replace any container that was in the public gallery, which is terrifying. So focusing in on those undocumented APIs to perform unintended functionality or to evade detection is a major focus for me. For 2023, some of the research focus that I have is really trying to dive deep into those undocumented APIs that I mentioned. There has been a lot of success lately and even historically with abusing those. Most recently, there was the Lightspin ECR vulnerability that came to light where it turns out you could just replace any container that was in the public gallery, which is terrifying. So focusing in on those undocumented APIs to perform unintended functionality or to evade detection is a major focus for me.